we move to the next keynote address, the future trends of PV sales, and inviting our speaker, Mr. Colin Couchman, the Director of Global Automotive Sales Forecasting, IHS Markit. He, ladies and gentlemen, is a global analyst specializing in light vehicle forecasting, manufacturer model program strategies, and vehicle segmentation analysis. He oversees the international bespoke forecasting projects for major clients, having more than 20 years of direct experience in forecasting trends in the automotive industry.
Okay, thank you very much, and namaste. Great to be here. Obviously, long day for you. We've got another 15 minutes or so from me. I do have some slides, I believe, somewhere. Thank you.
This is okay. Okay. Slides? Yeah.
There we go. Thank you very much. I had slightly less time than expected, so I'm going to move fairly briskly through the materials. So, take some pictures if you feel free. But essentially, the idea is to set in context India on the global stage, but also focus in on our expectations for India in the coming years. So this one here is really to say, the pressures on the world. A bit later on, we've got a session to relive 1983, but certainly in automotive terms, no one wants to relive 2019. So very, very flat growth in many markets, as you can see there, and very steep declines in areas of the world that we were sort of counting on for volume growth. So China in particular down very significantly, as we all know, but obviously for you guys here in India down pretty significantly, double-digit fallback in demand. A lot of the guys earlier referenced, many months of negativity, and we're hoping for better things in the coming period. Here's just a few key factors impacting the outlook as we see it into the future. Obviously, the demand outlook is very, very challenging, especially for China, especially here in India. The emissions regulations are becoming more and more stringent. You've been through the BS6 push here in India. Good progress, really, on that accelerated schedule. We've seen a similar accelerated schedule in China, so they're similarly working through in terms of China 6 and rebalancing inventory and demand and production all together there, so similar really. But China as the motor in volume terms for global growth has gone off the boil, stalled a bit if you like. So that weakness continues. The coronavirus is something we're working very, very hard on to understand the implications for China, and clearly that could derail the recovery very, very significantly. Elsewhere in the world, the mature markets have their own set of problems, so the USA probably trending down from that sort of recovery. The trade policy, another one worth looking at, obviously for phase one trade deal for China, in a sense provides a degree of relief, but obviously those trade tariffs still much with us. And will Donald Trump move on to looking at other countries, European Union, maybe here in Asia, once the China stuff is partly resolved, right? Rebound markets, ones we're looking at quite closely. So in a technical sense, maybe there's a bit of recovery prospects there for markets like Russia, Brazil, Turkey, Argentina, Iran, fairly risky places in terms of relying on demand to do much in terms of offering growth. But really the last 3 points there have been touched on through the day, the SUV demand versus these growing emissions regulations, what happens to these very bold OEM expectations for electrification, very expensive gamble really, especially as we have ongoing pressure from the climate change agenda, COP21, COP26 this year. Are the customers ready for the real challenges that those environmental concerns pose for the industry? And clearly, mobility, again, mentioned very much here today, fast evolving, all the rest of it. In many ways, India personifies mobility in some way, shared mobility in particular. The way in which cars are used and share the roads with other forms of transport is pretty bewildering for a first timer here in India. And really, the pathway for the world is very challenging, bewildering in some ways. So these are sort of core challenges for the world. So, those fall roughly into four categories. The trade framework, how the world is almost deglobalizing to a certain extent with the tariff and retaliation around the world. The pathway to electrification, hugely expensive, big bets from many, many manufacturers around the world, massive sums of money needed to roll that out. And obviously from the infrastructure guys as well, how do we replicate the charging infrastructure of the world to encompass, the refueling infrastructure we've been used to in the past. So some pretty hard choices ahead for governments, for car makers, for people like yourselves in terms of where to put your investment, which technologies are going to win through, and that could engender some fairly significant changes to the automotive landscape. We've already seen here in India some fairly interesting alliances crop up as the Western OEMs seek to understand what best to do in a market like India, and obviously as some of the other OEMs club together in order to galvanize the investment required to continue to operate in many of the world's automotive markets. And consolidation is another big issue. We've seen here in here in India, the Chinese guys are coming, more of them on the way, we expect. And maybe some of this is being forced to a certain degree by their requirements elsewhere in the world. So a very quick look at China, parallels really in the downturn with India in a sense, with some of the key points there. Obviously a banking crisis of sorts there, the emissions regulations changeover, and clearly an emphasis on electrification shifting from incentive to investment from the OEM. So there are parallels there with China. India, and really, just to quickly touch on the coronavirus crisis. So clearly ever present in our minds, we're working through this. Something like 90% of production in China is now stalled in terms of finished vehicle build and to a certain extent parts and logistics and distribution. So clearly it's not just a China crisis, as the supply chain disruption is clearly going to influence much of the Asia region, and already has to a certain extent for some manufacturers, including guys based here in India. This is one way to track it. So this is just a simple analysis of the spread of the disease in order to try and quantify the impact directly on production. And we've actually come up with a series of scenarios based upon the longevity of the crisis in terms of the infection rate and the peak level of the infection. So if it drags through for a couple more weeks, we're scaling it anywhere from 400,000 to up towards 1.7 million units of disrupted production. Why is this interesting for you guys? Well, obviously this is going to have a knock-on impact to the Chinese economy. The longer it lasts, the greater that impact will be, and obviously that will then start to knock on to surrounding regions, especially ASEAN, but also some key commodity producers, and supply chain disruption is expected to follow. Very quick look at India. So obviously your backyard. Volatility we've talked about through the day. The challenge of BS6, clearly, the government gave you a very bold do-or-die challenge there to skip BS5 and jump straight to BS6 for the entire industry, right through from two-wheelers all the way up to the big trucks and buses, and obviously the requirement to re-engineer the refining capacity, make sure the fuels are available at the pump in time, and all the rest of it. So a massive challenge. Obviously the industry has risen to this challenge amazingly and looks on track to deliver, but obviously the disruption at the same time from the financial crisis, and also some of the fallback in the economic growth in India clearly has exacerbated the challenge for you guys, and the hope is that in the coming years growth returns to the market. Not every storm lasts forever, clearly, and that's a question mark for China. Obviously today the government minister, the honourable government minister, has sort of more or less not confirmed, but he's heavily hinted that scrappage scheme is on the way, obviously starting with on the commercial side perhaps, and the hope, certainly from our forecasting point of view, is that comes down to the passenger vehicle area, and obviously is a key part of the mobility drive, the move to green mobility, and obviously a strong part of building a strong nation, because a strong industrial sector, especially automotive as a flagship industry, is clearly key when we're thinking about where the growth prospects are for a market like India. And into the long term, big numbers on there. but we think, degree of support from shared mobility, from some of these new mobility drivers will clearly engender, with the support of the scrappage scheme, will engender some big numbers. India is still at a low level of motorization compared to other parts of the world. We track through the China forecast, compare it to India, and there's still a good deal of density to be fulfilled. There's still a growing middle class. Okay, the economic crisis has blown us off track to a certain degree, but it's a young demographic, it's a vibrant entrepreneurial country, and we do expect great things from the future. Doesn't come without risks. Obviously, there's risks to the forecast. Clearly, the disrupting technologies are something we've talked about significantly today. Lots and lots of attention on that. What do they all mean? Obviously, it's the theme of the entire day, right? So clearly, there is room for risk there. Stimulus, government stimulus in particular, and support from taxation, incentive, and also on the investment side is clearly required. The green agenda, the support on the environmental side as we seek to see more electrification of every kind really around the world. How does India play into that is clearly a key question. And uncertainty, some of the uncertainty around the near-term outlook could actually delay some of the investment plans. Some of the Chinese guys might scale down some of their expectations. Maybe some of the export strategies could be curtailed in a sense as they wait and see a little bit how the market pans out. You need a decent domestic base in order to justify a decent production base in order to engender a decent export base. So clearly an issue there. A very quick look at Europe. So Europe's an area, and obviously for you guys, the parallels on the emissions side in particular, Europe's got a fantastic set of challenges ahead. Very, very challenging on the CO2 front. Europe uses CO2 as a measurement of emissions, and 2021 is when we have to move to a 95-gram fleet average. That's got a degree of difficulty that we can't underestimate. Europe is not one region. It's not got one set of taxation. It's a myriad mixed bag of taxation. So it's got one emission standard, but it's got 27, 28, 30 different taxation standards, and each country is moving at a different rate. So just as you had disruption through the movement to BS6, the European Union area will certainly have dramatic shifts as they focus in on electrification in the coming years, and they ratchet up some of those challenging agendas. So, just a quick look at 2020. So we do expect another year of consolidation for India. Obviously, these forecasts do come with a degree of a health warning in a literal sense for China, and in a metaphorical sense for other parts of the world. Clearly, the challenge and the risk seems to be on the downside as we enter these uncharted territories of the coronavirus. And clearly, for a market like India, we're hoping for a degree of stabilization through 2020, ready to set us back on a decent course for 2021, hopefully helped by the scrapping incentives, rollout of the scrapping programs across the country. We're seeing a lot of activity on that front in terms of getting the infrastructure ready to actually have scrapping, and obviously that needs to be in play before anything meaningful can happen. So put it all together gets us here. So, global car market's blown off course. We don't think it's a trend break in terms of, the desire to motorize around the world. Obviously, mature markets under pressure in terms of where they're at. But clearly, APAC region is an area of intense scrutiny when we're searching out prospects for global growth. And India is seen as a key market behind that. So just to finish up, try and keep it to the 15 minutes. I know it's tea time and then some very interesting entertainments coming up into the evening, so I don't want to stand in front of that. But clearly the takeaway is uncertainty is living with us. Challenges for China. The coronavirus is a big unknown. How long is it going to last for? When do we see peak of the epidemic? And will there be further contagion through the automotive market and economy into the great wider supply chain? Clear one. And then clearly the emissions challenges all around the world, but here in India especially, but obviously very, very focused in Europe. Europe could be the blueprint for a future for electrification, but it also could be a blueprint for a pretty scary outlook in terms of planning your model mix and organizing your nameplate lineup in different markets around around the region. So maybe some parallels there for a future legislative approach for India. So mixed prospects elsewhere in the world, technical recoveries for some, which should help drive that bottom line, but clearly the SUV boom is still with us here in India as well. A lot of product pumped into the market. We saw that at the auto show. Still a lot of excitement generated by SUVs. How these fit in with the emissions thing and the EV is a bit of a wild card. Our expectation is that newer concepts will embrace the crossover format, albeit in a different way in terms of electrification. So there's still plenty of room for growth in that format, but clearly challenges bringing it to market and understanding what consumers want in the future. And just a last point there, so fast-moving mobility, the electrification, it's all to play for, right? It's game-changing stuff, and negotiating the pathway to the future has never been more challenging. So that's it from me. Enjoy the rest of the day, and thanks for listening. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Couchman, for this Outlook Forecast 2020. As you said, it is challenging, complex, but yes, exciting. And to express thanks, may I request Mr. Sabujani to please join us in presenting the memento. If I can request you, sir, to please present the memento. Thank you for analyzing two major economies of the world. One, of course, our immediate neighbor, China, which is facing a downturn because of the natural disaster. India facing this downturn because of the transformation and transition we are going, and also analyzing some of the major global markets, the European markets, where you see again a challenging environment, but a very promising one.